Okay, good evening and welcome. Welcome to one and all. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to the 2021 Martha Sonnenschein Memorial Lecture. As many of you remember, Irving Sonnenschein, who was a dear friend, created this lecture series to help perpetuate Martha's legacy and to shine a spotlight on the role of women's leadership within and beyond the Jewish community. Martha's birthday was in May, and it was very meaningful for Irving to have this event at this time of the year. I want to say at the beginning, may the learning that we do tonight accrue to the merit of both Martha and Irving of blessed memory. One of the great lessons to emerge from the themes of Shemitah that we read about this week is the message of hope. Someone might be down on their luck. Maybe they've fallen on hard times. Maybe they're in debt. And every day when they wake up, they look at the calendar and Shemitah is one day closer today than it was yesterday. Hope is on the horizon. The day is coming when their debts will be erased and they'll have a chance to start over again. Shemitah is one of the great reminders that in difficult times, we should always be thinking about how we can give people hope. To my mind, one of the most powerful sources of hope for our future and for the future of the Jewish people is the quality of the educators to whom we've entrusted our children in this generation. When I think about the people responsible for educating the next generation of Jewish leaders, when I think about individuals like our speaker this evening, it's very easy to feel hopeful about where we're headed. Way back when Mrs. Krupka Berger davened at the Jewish Center on a regular basis, many of us had the good fortune of learning from her whenever we prevailed upon her to share words of Torah with our shul. It's not just the breadth of her erudition or the quality of her pedagogy, it's her thoughtfulness and her character that make her such a bracha for our children and for our community. Today, as many of you know, she serves as Dean of Faculty at the Ramaz Upper School, where she's taught Tanakh and Jewish philosophy for the last 15 years. In addition to that role, she shapes Judaic studies curricula, teaches interdisciplinary seminars, and is heavily involved in student guidance and student life. Her master's in Jewish philosophy is from Columbia University, where her thesis focused on the messianic writings of Rabbi Isaac Abarbanel. It's a pleasure now to turn things over to our Martha Sonnenschein Memorial Scholar, Miss Miriam Krupka Berg.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Levine, and thank you for having me. Thank you to Rabbi Bichler, who I have been in touch with for well over a year now, when I was originally slated to speak last May, which we then postponed. And it's really wonderful to be here in memory of Martha Sonnenschein and Irving, learning with you in this space, even if it's a bit of a different space than we had originally intended. So really a pleasure to be here. I think what we'll do is we'll jump in and I'm gonna share my screen with you all here, and we can definitely put any questions you have in the chat as you think of them, or we can kind of take them all at the end as well. So here we go. In preparation for Shavuot, can everyone see the opening slide, the princess and the pauper. Okay, so I want to and we've got a couple 19th century paintings here representing Esther and Ruth. Esther and Ruth are two of the characters we'll talk about tonight. I'm going to get really ambitious and also talk about the female heroine of Megillat Shir HaShirim, the Ra'aya. So we'll see if we get there. We'll start with these two though. So let's begin. The five Megillot, while they very much constitute a group in our minds, I teach a course called Chamesh Megillot, they're really never discussed as a unit by Chazal. They're only referred to as Megillot in separate places. They're only mentioned as part of the time of the year that they're read, or as part of the time period in which they occurred. They're never really a group. So in Bava Batra, when the order of the books of the Ketuvim were listed, the Megillot are placed in chronological order amongst the other books of the Ketuvim, right? So the earliest time that we see them together, mentioned as a group is the Leningrad manuscript about the year 1000, where the Megillot are finally grouped together as a group. The Leningrad Codex that I kind of just put up for you here is the oldest complete manuscript of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. The Aleppo Codex, which is the text against which the Leningrad Codex was corrected, is several decades older, but as many of you might know, there are pieces of the Aleppo Codex that are missing. So it makes the Leningrad Codex the oldest complete codex of the Masorah that has survived intact. The codex is a handwritten book as opposed to a scroll. And this is the first place where we really see the Five Megi Lo listed as a group. Otherwise, there's really not that much that they have in common. So, if you look at them, they're clearly different time periods. They're different literary genres, right? If you think about Kohelet's kind of part wisdom literature, part autobiography. You have Ruth and Esther that are these short novellas. You have Eicha, which is grief or sorrow as its theme, but is also lyric poetry. So they stem from different time periods. They're not even a group when it comes to halachic practices, right? Esther stands out from the five in that it's the only one that's required to be read from a cloth, right? Maybe that's why it's the only one that's actually called Megillat Esther. And, while it was the last to happen chronologically, it certainly takes precedence in terms of level of requirement. It's a straight out mitzvah from Chazal, only one with a mesechet for it. Eicha we read on Tisha B'Av, but it's really more of a minhag. It's not mentioned by the Gemara. There's a machloket about whether or not we make a bracha on reciting Eicha. Shir Shirim and Root, minhagim, no bracha. And Kohelet, there are many kehilot. No pun intended there, but they are etymologically connected. There are many kehilot that don't read Kohelet at all, right? So one approach is that all five are called Megillot because of their size. They're relatively small texts, right? The largest of the Megillot is Kohelet with 222 psukim. The smallest of the rest of Ktuvim is Daniel with 357. So a small piece of writing is called a Megillah. So Masechet Gittin, it says Torah, Megillah, Megillah Nitna, right? The Torah was given in short Megillot. So, maybe they're a group because they're all small texts, or in viewing them as a group, maybe they're a group because there's an obligation or minhag really to read them aloud as a tzibor at certain time periods, right? But even the custom of reading them aloud has originated in various pieces. Over the last, hundreds of years, there is an attempt to kind of group these five books together in some way. So interesting, and I've seen lots of attempts to do so. In the intro to the Chamesh Megillot Mikra, Gabrielle Cohen points out that one way to order them, if you can see on the screen here, is by the time of year in which they're read. Each one is connected to a different different one of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. So Esther is always read around the time that we're reading Shemot, Shir Hashir and Vayikra, Ruth when we're in Sefer Bamidbar, and Eicha to Devar, and Kohelet, Ruth to Bamidbar, Kohelet to Devarim. So this would put Esther first and kind of sees them as like Ketuvim style haftarot for that Sefer. And then he makes all these connections, right? That like there are themes of Kohelet that have to do with Breshit, themes of Eicha that always have to do with Devarim, which is like really interesting that he goes through. So there's this attempt to group them as a unit, but they're not really a unit in any way. They started being printed together in a book, Chamesh Megillot, because people needed to carry that to shul. So it was easy to just have kind of one book with all of them together. But what I want to do tonight is see them as a unit in another way. And the way I want to see all five as a unit, we're going to start primarily with Ruth and Esther. We'll bring the other three in, are that the characters of each of these Megillot are in conversation with each other from an intertextual perspective. They are talking to each other over the years, and they're actually all dealing with the same theme. So let's begin with what intertextuality actually is. There are a lot of ways of defining it, but the simplest way of defining intertextuality is the complex relationship that exists between a text. So understanding one text as a part of a web or a matrix of text. Now this can happen in a number of ways, right? So it happens usually, and we're going to go through three genres, and then we're going to take Ruth and Esther and show you how they kind of represent this conversation with each other. The characters are actually talking to each other. So you can do this through the idea, through motifs, through similar phrases that appear in different books, or rare words that appear. So when we say an intertextual text or two texts that can be read intertextually, one thing that we might mean is that there are there are themes that appear across both books. So let's say, a lot of times Esther is compared to Daniel, or Esther is compared to Yosef, because they're both about Jews rising to power in a foreign court. This is what Robert Alter kind of made more well known when he called, in his Art of Biblical Narrative, when he called it the type scene, right? And he talks about the hero of the Tanakh meeting his wife at a well, or the idea of the barren mother, right? These are themes that play over and over in Tanakh. And instead of saying like, oh, it's just a theme that's replaying itself, you can look at the stories together. And I'm sure many of you have done this in Shiurim, and you could say they inform each other in some way. Something about the story of Isaac and Rebecca, right, is setting some sort of paradigm so that if you want to truly understand the story of the next person who met his wife at a well, you need to first understand the story of Yitzchak and Rivka, and through their story, that will inform the story after. You actually can't understand any of the stories on their own. They have to be read together. And hold on to that, because you're gonna fully understand what that means. Hopefully when we're done, you will understand why you actually cannot understand Megillat Ruth well and completely if you're not reading it alongside its intertextual themed text of Esther. So bear with me through my intro. I promise you it'll make the learning richer. So that's kind of one type of biblical intertextuality, right? Formally recognizing, as Alter says, a particular kind of narrative moment that's repeating itself. Another type of biblical intertextuality is something that we call just kind of similar phraseology. So here's like a really good famous one, right? The Midrash loves intertextuality. It does it all the time. It's the way it really builds its approach to exegesis through intertextuality often. So for instance, here's a well-known one. And if you're following along on the source sheets, the numbers are similar. So it's 2, but it's also up on the screen. Medrash Rabin Breshit, Kishmoa Esav et Divrei Aviv, Vayizak Se'aka. So it quotes the famous pasuk of when Esav heard that the bracha had been stolen from him. We have this pasuk that says that he cried out a great and bitter cry, great and bitter sob. And the Heichan Nifra Lo, and I want to pause on that, what that means. But the Midrash says, oh, it's really interesting to note that a very similar phrase appears in Esther Dalet, Vayizak Se'aka Gedola Umara Ad Me'od, which was Mordechai responding to the edict. So we can say, okay, it's fine. It's just a phrase repeating itself. But if you want to read a text intertextually, you say, wait a minute. The writers of Esther had the entire Tanakh in front of them, for the most part, when they were writing. If they were quoting a phrase, or they chose to use a phrase very similar to an earlier one, then they must have wanted to almost use that phrase in some way to read the two stories together. And the Midrash says, we'll tell you why the writers of Esther did that, because the Heichan Nifra Lo, that actually the rabbis of the writers of the Midrash were saying, hey, there was something. Heichan Nifra Lo means, when did the payback occur? When did the punishment for Yaakov almost occur? And interestingly enough, the Midrash is saying the reason we want to use this phrase is because there was something that Yaakov did to Esav that wasn't completely correct. He caused pain, and therefore his descendants, Esav's descendant, Amalek and Haman, therefore at some point had to cause pain to the Jewish people, as almost like an understanding that Yaakov's pain that they caused Esav couldn't just fall into a vacuum, right? So that's a second kind of intertextuality, where you have similar phrases, where the texts are speaking to each other. And final one, which we'll come back to because I want to make sure we don't run out of time, is when you have rare language words, when there's a word that only appears a couple of times in Tanakh. So this example is Vayivez Esav et Bechora, where Esav shamed the Bechora because he sold it, and we see that word also appear again in Megillat Esther. And then again, the Midrash will often open up why are we using that particular word? There must be some relationship between the texts. Rav Yonatan Grossman of Gush Etzion defines it as when you keep one text in the back of your mind as you read another. The stories are somehow speaking to each other. They are informing how you view the later text. We might only read Esther as an amazing story of Jewish, Jewish survival and Jewish, and the story kind of coming out of the Megillah, but the Midrash also wants to remind you, right, that there was a pain that was caused earlier, and that's one of the reasons. And you can get into a whole philosophical, theological discussion about whether what Yaakov did was right, and Esther is almost proving that there was something about what Yaakov did that was questionable, even if he was doing what was right. Okay, so for us, let's keep that idea in mind. Two texts that through language or through themes that are similar are talking to each other. So now let's jump to Ruth and Esther. Okay, so if we wanted to start with themes in Ruth and Esther that are similar, it's actually kind of a really easy start, okay? Obvious commonalities. Number one, they both deal with the female heroine who asserts herself, takes chances, and succeeds in some sort of redemptive reversal of fortune due to a brazen scheme by the heroine. Both follow a narrative text, which is almost a short novella, right? And only books in Nevuim or Ketuvim really do this. One short contained story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? This kind of short story genre. Both women find themselves in a strange world and a community that is not their own. So if you think about it, it's a flip. Esther's outside of the Jewish community in this strange community that's not her own. Ruth is coming from the outside and joining this Jewish community, but instead of challenging the system itself, think about the stories, right? Esther kind of walking into to Achashverosh to save her people. Ruth with this Parak, this strange scene, scene, which we'll look at later on the threshing floor. They work their way out of marginalization by working within the system, right? They're working within the system's rules. Number two, okay. Number three, they both find themselves in questionable sexual situations, which form a major arc of the plot. Number four, both are narrative companion texts to historical periods and events going on in other parts of Tanakh. So if you think about it, Sefer Breshit has no companion text. There isn't another text happening while Breshit is happening, but Esther has Sefer Ezra. Shivat Zion, the return to the land of Israel, is taking place in Ezra, while at the same time, the story of Purim is taking place on the stage in Persia, which is a whole other shiur that we can talk about for a while, the intertextuality between Esther and Ezra, and why the Jews of Persia are rarely mentioned in Ezra and vice versa. If the two communities are extant at the same time, why do they not mention each other? And Ruth is a companion narrative to Sefer Shoftim, right? And we'll come back to that later. So both are these almost short stories that are inserted into time periods that another text is dealing with on a larger scale. And finally, if we're talking about kind of obvious commonalities, both deal deeply with the idea of divine intervention and providence in a more natural story, that the divine hand is hidden in the workings of normal causality, right? So implicitly in Esther and explicitly in Ruth. So Esther is obviously famous for no name of God, right? With a huge theme, Hester Panim, right? Esther, of God working behind the scenes, even if we can't really see him as clearly in the natural world. And Ruth is very interesting also in that God is not an actual character in the story, right? Think about so many of the stories of Chamisha Chumshei Torah or Navi, where there is a prophet or there is the voice of God or God himself as a character, right? Yomar Hashem. Ruth is not, God is not a character in the story. He only appears in the language of the people in the story, which you don't even have in Esther, right? As far as we know from the text in Esther, God doesn't appear at all. And even in the language of the people. And with Ruth, you do see them speak, right? Baruch Hashem, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. So there's a nice piece in the introduction to the JPS version of Ruth, which I'll quote, which says, the two women represent contrasts, right? On the one hand, there is the poor, mature widow who marries a Judean man. A woman whose chesed and maternity grants her a place in Israel's memory. Her claim to fame results from her actions in the domestic and familial spheres. On the other hand, there is the young Jewish woman who marries a foreign king and lives a life of luxury, and whose offspring, if there were any, are never mentioned, right? So that's also kind of an interesting contrast. These are their 5 similarities. I want to talk about contrasts a little. On the one hand, all of Ruth ends in the idea of dynasty and the religious dynasty that she creates through Boaz. Esther is a hero who's cut off from children and dynasty in terms of that. So kind of really interesting intertextual contrast. Esther's claim to fame comes from acting on the national, even international scale when she slaves her people from slaughter. So great. Okay, here are their similarities, interesting contrast. Thank you, Miriam. Good list. Gives me something to think about. What do these themes or these comparisons or these contrasts mean? What can we pull out from this kind of intertextuality? So, and obviously we still have to get to our other 3 Megi Lo. But what I want to do today is analyze how these 2 books, and then we'll bring in the rest at the end, deal with a very similar theme, but they present it through, and this is where we'll kind of get a good look at some closer pieces in the text. They present this theme through extremely contrasting images and language, rather than similar ones. So we're used to an intertextual discussion being about similar phrases, similar words, similar themes. These two books take the opposite extremes in terms of image and language, and when we will take a look more deeply at these differences, and it's through this contrast that the message that they each have to give is so much more powerful, and that the message is only created when you see these two books and then ultimately these 5 books together, such that we get more out of comparing the two than you would looking at each book alone, right? So let's start with this idea of differentiating imagery and language. And the first thing I really want to point out is that Ruth is a pastoral narrative. Okay, what is a pastoral narrative in literature? It's sometimes called the bucolic. And the pastoral narrative is a narrative that has these idyllic visions of simple, rural, country life. It's often represented in Renaissance debate as kind of the contemplative life, right? And we'll talk about what the debate there is in a moment. But if you think of the shepherd image in Torah, it's an emphasis on the natural, interactions with fields, agricultural, countryside, retreat from the life of the courts. Often in literature, pastoral narratives are overt social criticisms, right? Rural harmony contrasted with the corruption of the court or the city. We see this back and forth a lot in Torah, but I want to take a look at how we see this in Ruth. Almost all of Ruth takes place in the countryside. Okay, we're going to skip these. These are just some more examples of intertextuality. Which I want to skip for a moment. So let's pause here for a minute. This is just such a good example of pastorality in Shakespeare. The idea of the sojourn in the countryside, right? The pastoral countryside leading to happiness, personal education, growth, satisfaction, renewal. So this is from Shakespeare's As You Like It. It's a great example. The court people in As You Like It, right, are seeking refuge in rural life, the Forest of Arden. And it's only when they get into rural life, the countryside, that things are full of possibilities. While the court life, city life, which is often the negotium, right? That's the complex life versus the simple one. The involvement in business and civic life there's a criticism of that kind of life. If only we could all frolic in the countryside, life would be great. And As You Like It is such a good example. Shakespeare uses this all the time. Orlando and Rosalind, right, can only fall in love outside in the forest. Oliver controlling Orlando. There's the corruption and the stagnation of city life. And you can see here where the Duke says, now my co-mates and brothers in exile have not old custom made this life more sweet than that of painted pomp? Are not these woods more free from peril than the envious court? And then at the end, and this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brook, sermons in stones, and good in everything. Now, where Shakespeare uses a lot of the idea of the city life, the corrupt city life inside the city gates versus outside. And obviously it's all throughout literature. You could think of all these, so many dystopian works where there's no more contact with nature, right? Or we have full control over nature. We subvert it, which is a subversion of freedom or possibility. Huxley's Brave New World, is a great example. Think about all of technology taking over nature, mankind's structures taking over the world of nature. Well, where did Shakespeare and everyone get this from? This theme is all over Tanakh, right? And we'll take a look at the pastoral and root in a moment, but really all over Tanakh. Think about Moses in Egypt, leaving Egypt and becoming a shepherd. Shaul's corruption to David in the field. David is the shepherd, Shaul is the corrupt king. Achav and the vineyard of Navot, right? Vineyards often represent ideas of love and pastorality. The evil king is the person who leaves his gates. Think about Migdal Bavel, the first time a city is ever built in Tanakh, what it represents. Think about the way Tanakh opens, right? Gan Eden, the idea that the ideal, the idyllic, the place we want to live, the place we want to be, perfection, is trees and country and outside and nature. And the roots, and I want to come back, we'll come back to a couple of Tanakh descriptions, but the largest chunks of non-pastoral descriptions in Tanakh are usually a foreshadowing for something negative. Bad things happen within the walls of the city. And we're going to see more examples of this come out. Now, here's what's interesting. Ruth is a decidedly pastoral narrative, and Esther is a decidedly city one. Everything is taking place within the gates of the city in Esther, right? Everything in Ruth until chapter 4, which takes place right outside the city gates, and we'll talk about that. Everything else in Ruth is the field, right? So take a look at Paragolif, right? Vayehi b'mei shodah shoftim, vayehi rav ba'aretz, vayelech ish mi beit lechem Yehuda lagor b'stei Moab. So even in the language, he went to live in the fields of Moab, and we know when Naomi ultimately returns, right at the end, B'tchilat Ktsor Sa'orim, right? They describe to you what's going on. It's an agricultural language, the book. It's telling you where we are in the agricultural universe, right? And the entire story, as we know, is about gathering in the fields. Everything is taking place between the sheaves of wheat in the field. So in Parak Bet, Vatomer Ruta Moaviyah El Naomi, Elacha Na'asadev L'ktav Shibolim, right? The entire plot, the whole story, where she meets Boaz, where the plot of Parak Gimel occurs, is in an agricultural setting, and natural agriculture, where people are feeding themselves through the work that is occurring in the field. The food themes, right? The food and sustenance words that appear in Ruth are a major theme. I mean, we see the ideas of the sheaves and the ears of grain and the barley and the chitim. These words are repeated kind of over and over. This kind of like simple life in which sustenance takes place because we work the fields. And it is a pastoral narrative because in the end, it's this kind of beautiful idyllic story, right? Where everything works out perfectly. Happy ending, freedom and possibility occur in the fields. That's where Ruth meets Boaz, right? He greets her. We know this is actually kind of a famous intertextual reference. If you look in Parak Bet, Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayan Boaz Vayomer La, he says, everything that you did for your mother-in-law was told to me after your husband died. So that's a clear intertextual reference to Lech Lecha, right? That Avraham too, the first Jew who left everything he knew to go to a strange place. That's the way Boaz meets Ruth. And really, aside from the rough conflict of the opening psukim, everything else about Ruth is this wonderful pastoral narrative taking place in the fields, right? Until we get to Parak Daled, where they're outside the city gates as this theme plays out. Now, Esther, right, is a decidedly city narrative. So if you think about the words that appear, the language that appears over and over in Esther, city gates, law, noble, satraps, edict, power, partamim, achashtar panim. There's 5 different words for different kinds of rulers in the book, right? Everything is about the rule of law, and one can argue the corrupt rule of law, right? Which has been talked a lot about in terms of Ruth, in terms of Esther, that Esther is a idea of the city gates, right? And the monarchy and the city gates as something that hurts the person on the bottom of the totem pole. Ruth is a story of this beautiful rise of the stranger and the person on the bottom of the totem pole who is taken care of by community. And Esther is really about that. If Esther and Mordechai hadn't gotten in there, the rule of law and the city gates would have harmed people immeasurably, right? So you have these kind of really interesting contrasting. You see it also in the food descriptions of Esther, right? The idea that that Esther, all the food is extravagant and processed, right? Mishke, yayin. There's no sense of the pastoral life. Their connection to food is not that they're out in the field and creating it on their own. It's this exaggerated sense of excess. Everything that happens in Esther takes place at some, incredible feast, right? Food to an extreme. While the food of Ruth is very simple, right? Even the processed food that's talked about in Ruth is like lechem, right? Like the simple bread, right? We're not seeing words like yayin, right? We're seeing kelly, like parched grain, and things that seem so much more simple in terms of the pastoral life versus the extravagant, luxurious life of Esther. Now, very interesting, great. That's a really kind of interesting contrasting narratives, right? And we can see it as social criticism, the social critique of the book of Esther. And here, we got a little bit here. Asam mishtel lechol sarav avadav. Everything is about the sarav and the avadav in Esther, the servants, the people working for somebody else. In Boaz, even his servants, he calls the na'arim, the boys. There aren't these like 8 layers, you know, of promotion and supervision that are kind of going on in the way they are in Megillat Esther, right? Everything's very exaggerated in Achashverosh, right? Everything's about him and his advisors, and they're making rules, and they're making rules that obviously hurt other people. The idea of dat vadin, law, is repeated kind of extensively in Esther, but one can make the case that in Esther, in which, and Yoram Azoni really makes this case, I think, beautifully in the Dawn, that he says that it's a mockery of the political system, right? Just like many years later, Shakespeare uses the language of the pastoral and the language of the city to mock the idea of the system. So, you know, I've heard many beautiful shiurim and read many wonderful texts that Esther is a book about what happens when power gets structuralized in ways that, you know, in ways that are no longer connected to the natural universe and who we are as people. So, you know, he talks about Achashverosh is this political ruler who never makes a decision of substance on his own. He demonstrates his power by issuing commands and having them obeyed, having his subjects fear him, etc. And you know, he's a character that we are mocking, that is meant to be mocked in terms of that. So when you understand that that is true, right? And I just kind of threw in this Gemara in Masechet Eruvin because it's a good example here of the idea of the fields and the cities being contrasted. I mean, this happens really all the time, and I can give you so many examples of the idea that the ideal of Torah learning and the Torah scholars are connected to the field, right? Like the residents of the cities or people that we look down on and that we criticize. I recognize that I am giving this shiur to an Upper West Side city-based, and I always, when I talk about this with my students, I was like, I know we live in the city, you guys are city people, we're not criticizing the city people, but it is a theme that really appears a lot in Tanakh. You see the movement between the critique of the city life, which is often comes along with the political structures of city life, versus this kind of open field that doesn't come with rules, that doesn't come with rules that end up taking advantage of the people who are not the ones making the rules, right? So we look at these two, and then we have a problem. Because if Ruth is the story of beautiful idealism, the woman, there's not a single political rule going on in those first at least 3 chapters of Ruth, right? Nobody is, you know, there are references to the fact that there are halachot that are going to help Ruth because she can go to certain fields, but we don't have this like political system that's helping Ruth, right? In fact, right, the book opens with the words Vayehi bimei shvot hashoftim, and we know that the lack of a king, Ein Melech B'Yisrael, was not necessarily a good thing in Ruth. But we have this kind of beautiful narrative in Ruth. And the problem we're left with is the end of Ruth is about the birth of monarchy, right? And you really, if you view the 2 books of Ruth and Esther as almost inclusios or bookends of Tanakh, right? The story of Ruth is taking place as we enter the land of Israel in the times of the Shoftim, right immediately prior to the birth of the monarchy. And the story of Esther is taking place at the end of them, after the death of the monarchy, of the Davidic dynasty. But if the point of the 2 stories is Esther is a critique of monarchy, and many say that one of the reasons that it is a mockery of the system is because the Jews in the times of Esther are mourning the loss of the Davidic dynasty and the death of, you know, their political system. And it's almost like Esther is like the book of Esther was a commentary to the people saying, you don't need it. Monarchy is bad. And honestly, in the entire book of Melachim, one can make the case monarchy doesn't work, right? You know, too much power, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is not a good thing. Look at Achashverosh. Look at what's going on. Let's rebuild our lives without it. And then one can make the case that the book of Ruth is saying the same thing. There was no monarch. Agreed, there was some chaos because there was no monarch, but look, it can work with no monarch. Boaz was the right kind of leader. He was not given power by the system, and Ruth was taken care of. The poor woman was taken care of. Put a king in charge and the poor people do not get taken care of. Seems to be many of the themes that come out of Tanakh. So then why does Ruth end in the birth of the monarchy? Doesn't that detract from the entire message? If Ruth is the pastoral narrative, right? The beauty of the field, the bucolic life, the meeting of her future husband out in a field somewhere amongst some sheaves of wheat, right? The forest of Arden. And Esther is a mockery of the law, right? And we know that there was a lot to be said about what went wrong with the Davidic dynasty. Why end the book with the birth of the Davidic dynasty? Or to flip the question, why create a story about the birth of the dynasty out of the pastoral, right? It is a pastoral narrative that ends in a city life. The last chapter takes place at the gates of the city and follows rules, right? The rules that are taking place with the Boaz's taking of Ruth, right? Chalitza, Yibum, those were rules they were following there. Those were not made up, oh, you're her relative, you should take her. They're following a system of laws at the end there. And it's almost like the first 3 chapters of the fields move into a system of laws. So what are we supposed to take out of that? Which one is it? Is it the beauty of the field? Is it the pastoral? Is it the critique of the city life, etc.? And there are a lot of ways to look at this. And I want to kind of look at it in one particular way that I think will bring in Shir HaShirim and the other Megi Lo in kind of a very, in a more interesting way. Wait, we'll go to Shir HaShirim in a minute. So let's go back for a moment to the timing, a realization of the timing that Ruth took place in, right? Shoftim, right? It was a time of chaos, right? But Ruth was canonized, right? We decided to make it part of the canon during a time much later, right? Ezra or later, we're not exactly sure, when they're trying to rebuild a new community out of destruction. And they're looking back and they're struggling with this question, right? We are struggling with this question that the Nevi'im struggled with, and probably all political philosophers in history struggled with, which was the tension between the rule of law and no rule of law. And how do we deal with the fact that often the need for the rule of law is there? You read the book of Shoftim and it repeats Ein Melech B'Yisrael a number of times. There was no king. And the problem of no king was, civil war, rape, total chaos, total disconnect between the communities of Am Yisrael. We needed law, right? And the question of all these Nevi'im and all these political philosophers has always been, how do we institute a system of law that allows for governing society in a way that works and that doesn't turn into worse than the chaos of the lack of rule of law, right? What are the rules that govern society? How do we create a structure that is used for the people instead of against the people? Is government a system of fickle bribes, or are they rules that are creating boundaries that work? So Root is about open pastorality. Aviva Zornberg points out really beautifully that root. So I always ask my students, what does root mean? And they're always like, I don't know. And I'm like, what does ruthless mean? And they say, oh, Ruth means to be kind, and chesed is a huge theme of Ruth. But Aviva Zornberg actually points out that root, the root, R-O-O-T, of root, can come from Revalue or hirva, which means to saturate, to drench, to infiltrate, to flow everywhere. No boundaries, right? You're out in the field. It's pastoral. There's no rules. There's no gates. There's no place I have to be, right? The beginning of the book of Ruth is couched in this idea of we don't need rules. We just need kindness, right? But then the book ends, right, in this idea of you need stability, you need structure, you need some sort of system that is actually going to take care of this woman. So, I mean, again, you think a lot about Thomas Paine and early American political philosophy, which focused a lot on the idea of no king, right? We need some sort of structure, we need some sort of government, but not that government, right? Not what happened over there, because that government is bad. And we are not going to get political now, but we could probably have the same argument about democracy, right? Is it working? Is it not? Is it setting rules that work, or is it not? And that's kind of the argument that takes place here too. Should it be 2 years? Should it be 4 years? What are the rules that will allow for society to function and for the underdog, right, to be taken care of, and what are not? So how free should the markets be? What should our social policies look like? How do we define private property, right? I mean, all of these things are, how many rules should there be? At what point do too little rules create chaos? At what point do too many rules, right, impinge on our freedoms and and especially the question that Esther and Ruth are really dealing with, how do we take care of the most vulnerable in our society, right? So if we think about this for a moment, chapter 4 of Ruth is all about correct structure and interpretation of the law, right? How to create something that works correctly in terms of the law and that takes care of the people who it's meant to take care of. In Esther, the law is a joke, right? Paragolif, Achashverosh is presenting this case before the judges, and it's a joke. It's all about his own sense of power. And the case that appears before the judges in Parak Dalet of Ruth, or that's appearing in terms of the case of Ruth, is about taking care of Ruth. So the book of Ruth is couched between the chaos of Sefer Shoftim, right? And the creation, ironically maybe, of the political system of David, right? And the reason that it's couching that story there is this theme that the order of government has to come from a sense of the pastoral, right? No order is chaos. You need the political system, but it needs to flow out of the pastoral story, because city life has the potential to be deadly, right? To make political structure what it should not be. And sadly, one could argue that a lot of what the Davidic dynasty turned into was what we especially feared right from the beginning. And Esther is a time when that mockery is taking place. You think about the Torah being given at Har Sinai, right? It was given in the wilderness, no boundaries, no structure, no government, because it's associated with no boundaries and no rules, right? So this idea of how do we create rules that work is a theme that's really working itself through both of these books. And the two of them are in conversation with each other, because the book of Esther is saying, I don't know, it can go really badly, right? And the book of Ruth is saying, no, the pastoral and the idea of openness and the idea of rules has an idyllic quality to it. But if you put Ruth against the book of Shoftim, we know that that can be chaotic. We need to introduce the dynasty via Ruth, though, to say, be careful. Allow for hirva, allow for saturation, allow for infiltration, allow for thought. Don't structure the government so tightly that the rules become a mockery. So those two are in conversation with each other. Now, once we realize that, then the role of Shir HaShirim becomes really, really interesting, because if one would say off the top of their heads, what is the language of the book of Shir HaShirim, I would say, oh, pastoral, right? Like scholars talk about the imagery of the book of Shir HaShirim. Its imagery, it has so much rich floral, flowering plants, spices, fruit trees, right? Think about the plants, that appear. I read somewhere, 21 species of plants and 15 species of animals, right? Like the book is so about nature, Shir HaShirim, right? However, it's only pastoral some of the time. The language of Shir HaShirim actually moves back and forth between the language of the fields and the language of the city. So let's take a look at that, because what Shir HaShirim adds to the understanding of Ruth and Esther is actually quite fascinating. So take a look here at Paragolif, right? The opening speech in Paragolif is, Al tiruni shani shcharchoresh safatni hashemesh b'nei yimini charubi. The female character, the Ra'aya, is a woman of the field, right? She's saying, oh, I work out in the fields. That's why I'm dark, because I'm out working the fields all night. But then we switch into language of, right? The male turns to her and says, oh my goodness, you're so beautiful, just like the chariots and the steeds of a kingly court. And then he starts to talk about Torei zahav na'aselach, strings of pearls. That's a luxury item. That's an Esther imagery rather than a Ruth imagery. And then we go back to this, if you take a look in Parak Gimel, right, the ideas of the forest that we find ourselves in, or here, if you take a look at let's take a look, Parak Gimel, right? So Parak Gimel has more of this expensive language, right? The spices and the litter of Solomon and the guards surrounding, they're holding the sword, skilled in warfare, right? And then we go back to, Parak Dalet. It opens with Kimigdal David Savarech. You're like a fortress, a city language. And then we go back to all these Sonnenschein and hills of frankincense, and the idea that gardens, Gan Na'ul, so you've got all this pastoral imagery, all this forest imagery, but also all of this city imagery. And there's actually a lot that commentators talk about in terms of why some of the language of Shir HaShirim is so natural, and some of it is so kind of more processed or expensive. But the most beautiful reading of Shir HaShirim that I really ever seen, and I really highly recommend this sefer, because it is it really changed the way I think about Shir HaShirim, and then I think will overlay onto Ruth and Esther in an amazing way, was Rav Yuval Shurlow, right? founder of Zohar, which is an Israeli religious Zionist organization, and was the Rosh Yeshiva and Yeshivat Hesder, Amita Rosh Shaul in Renana. And most of us are familiar with the fact that Shir Hashirim is an allegory, right? Man and God. But what Rav Shirlo does with the allegory is he says as follows. He says that the story of Shir Hashirim, and then his whole sefer, is literally going line by line through Shir Hashirim, where he shows you how every line is feeding this allegory. He says the entire sefer is that the female is a shepherd girl and the male character is a prince. And everything that appears pastoral in Shir Hashirim is her language. She's speaking about what she knows, the fields, and everything that he says, because he comes from a wealthier, kind of socially higher demographic, is always in the language of the city. So when he describes her, he says, Kemigdal David Savarech, or this chariots in Paro's palace. When she talks to him, she uses pastoral language because that's what she's used to, right? And what he says is their descriptions are different because they're speaking different languages. His are related to kingship, horses, wealth, tower, things he finds impressive. And she doesn't understand that. And her language is about the pastoral. And he says the whole story is about, can people of two different worlds have a relationship? She goes looking for him, right? The famous scene in Parak, right? Where the famous scene in Parak where she goes knocking on the door, right? Koldo Dido fake, and he goes knocking on her door at night because she goes looking for him in Parak Gimel, but he's surrounded by his chariots and by his steeds because he's busy, and she can't find him, so she goes back to sleep, and he only gets out of all his meetings late at night, right? And goes to knock on the door, and she says, "I'm tired. I've been working in the fields all day," and she goes to look for him. Finally, she gets out of bed to go look for him, and the watchmen come and beat her up. They don't know who she is. She's trying to get into the palace gates. What Shirlo does is amazing. He goes through the entire narrative and shows you that it's a story of a prince from a wealthy background and a shepherd girl trying to have a relationship with each other, and they are struggling, right? And at the very end, right, she says to him, Mi tencha ke'achli, right? I wish you were my brother. I wish you were just another shepherd boy. We can't make this work. I can't live palace life, and you don't understand my life. And I wish I could just take you home, right? And then the very last pasuk of Parachet is brachtoti. Can we just run away together? Like, can we not do this thing? I don't want to be a princess. You're surrounded by women of the courts. He says to her, I don't want the women of the courts. I want you. And what Rav Shirlo says is the main question of the Megillah is the gap between their worlds. The simple village girl and the powerful prince. Can they ever really love each other, right? So the Raya is introduced as an orphan, right? Who barely has a vineyard of his own, who's dark. She feels comely. She feels ugly because she has to work the field, right? And we could do a few hours on this. Every line of the Sefer is about, she's metzitz min harachim, standing behind the wall looking in because he's inside the palace and she can't get in, and it talks really about this struggle that they have, right? Which is they can't be on the same page and they're struggling to create a relationship. And Rav Shirlo points out that the book, yes, it can be read the way the Midrash reads it as history of the people of Am Yisrael and God. But if you read it like this, the allegory is so much richer because the end is not a perfect ending, right? They're still struggling, right? He says, I have to stay here. She says, I don't want to stay here. Run away with me. They're consistently struggling. But that Shir Hashirim ultimately becomes about that struggle between God and the common man, right? God living in one world. It's a world that we don't understand. People, we don't feel like we can get there. We don't feel like we can have a relationship with the dwellers of that world. It isn't what we can understand. How much can we really come to know him? Are we speaking two different languages? He lives in a palace. We live in a village. Is it possible for there to be a relationship? And how would that work, right? So Rav Shirlo really goes into this, and then you start to understand that is the beauty of the book, right? That that what's happening in Shir Hashirim is the struggle between, can we interact with a world that we don't understand? And then we start to understand that Shir Hashirim and Ruth and Esther are the same struggle on two different planes, right? Ruth and Esther are talking about our relationships with each other on a political, social plane, in the same way that Shir Hashirim is talking about our relationship with God in the same way, right? How can we create a system, right? In Ruth, the king and the common man is the same struggle as in Shir Hashirim, God and the common man, right? Can we create a palace? Can we create a system that might feel different than the common man, right? Not without just chaos where everybody does their own thing. We need someone who makes the rules in a political system. But how do we create something where we make the rules, right? Where the people who make those rules don't end up hurting the people on the other. How can we create that relationship? Well, in the relationship between man and God, it's easy because we trust that the halacha and the rules that God are making are there for us to have a relationship with him. So what's happening is that in Shir HaShirim, the walls of the palace and the city gates represent separation, right? From people, from understanding people, from the common man, right? But there, right, we trust that the rules make sense and that they're working to help rather than hurt us. So what's kind of happening here, and I want to take a quote from a book that I think really speaks to this, that the entire purpose, right, of the book of Shir HaShirim is to say that there is a relationship that can happen between the common man and the person or the God in charge. And we trust that that relationship can take place. And it uses Shir HaShirim, the same language as the pastoral versus the city, as the books of Ruth and Esther use, right? That kind of language. And I thought that the way Rabbi Joshua Berman writes it in his book, Created Equal, really spoke to me, right? He says, look, if much of biblical writing reveals an ambivalent attitude towards the notion of monarchy, I would suggest it's not because of fear of the Almighty being marginalized, right? That we're not just afraid that the reason that if one asks for a king, it's a problem because you might forget God. But really, if you read through a lot of the texts about monarchy in Tanakh, the texts are reflecting a fear that a strong monarchy results in the marginalizing of the common man, right? I mean, you think about all of these stories, Achad and Kerem Navot, and, just all these stories where the person on the bottom is harmed by the person on top. And then he says, the idea that the God-human encounter, right, is also portraying a relationship with that kind of language and that kind of relationship. The biblical texts are portraying a relationship which honor can be reciprocally bestowed between God and Israel and be between God and the common man of Israel, right? Yes, it's a melech and an am, but it's also a marriage. Think about Shir HaShirim. And it's a marriage that can take place between the city and the country. Those things can take place, right? In the same way that Ruth and Esther are kind of conversing with each other about whether or not this marriage between political government and mankind can happen, right? And they're asking it in different ways. Esther is asking it by mocking the monarchy at a time when we're struggling with the loss of it. And Ruth is asking it by respecting the monarchy and by leading into it with the pastoral language of the beginning of the book. So this is something, and there's so many examples of how they're dealing with the same question, Ruth, Esther, and Shir HaShirim, right? How can that relationship occur? Marriage in Ruth is real and justified. The marriage between Esther and Achashverosh is a sham. And then Shir HaShirim is also about marriage, that kind of marriage that's taking place, or the romance between God and man. So a lot of these themes and a lot of these languages are being reiterated and are being used in all three of these books to make different points about overcoming a gap between worlds, and how that gap between worlds can both enforce a relationship, create that relationship, let it nourish, let it grow, or kill it, right? And I have this discussion with my students because they're like, oh my God, the halachic system, all the rules. Like, if Judaism didn't have so much rules, I would be such a good Jew, right? That question of what do the rules accomplish? What do they do? What do they create? What do they ensure takes place? What happens when the rules turn into the rules of Achashverosh, right? Where the word for law is a mockery, right? Are there situations in which we turn those rules into a mockery, or can we respect that rule system in a way that it's Parak of Ruth, where the rules work for her? And how do we create a balance between our own individual pastorality and our freedom out in nature and the rules that make our system and that our society work, right? And when you think about the idea that Ruth and Esther are both have almost enforced residence in an alien land, right? They're both members of a group that they don't belong in, and they're both struggling with how to become part of that. Well, isn't Shir HaShirim also talking about the same thing, right? We struggle, the Ra'aya is struggling in a world she doesn't belong in. Often humanity, when it comes to religiosity or spirituality or halacha, some of it can feel like, oh, I don't want to do that. I just want to do my own thing right now. I'd rather be out in the forest. why do I have to follow the rule? It feels almost unnatural. It feels almost like a world that we have to teach, we have to struggle to be a part of, and yet a world in which the rules or the system can actually create great inspiration and great movement. So I think we're starting to run short on time, and I want to just take any questions anyone has. So we'll leave it as those three. I'll just point out that the imagery in Eicha is also very much about a city gone wrong. So you've got that there, and I will leave it up to you to guess how I tie Kohelet into all of this. But I think I just kind of briefly want, and there's so much more we can talk about Esther versus Ruth. The storytelling in Esther is very flat. You don't have a lot of narrative. Ruth is almost all narrative. It's actually really interesting. Close to 60 out of 85 psukim of Ruth are dialogue, characters actually talking to each other. Most of Esther is flat. This and this was said to somebody, and that really ties, into this theme in some ways as well. But I'll end on this. There's a line attributed to Rav Nachman that he used to say that that many people tell their children stories to put them to sleep, or he would say the non-Jewish world tells their children stories to put them to sleep. We tell our children stories to wake them up. And I think that, to me, I love that line, because if you think about these short, cute little narratives, Esther and Ruth, both stories that our children love, right? I mean, they're great stories to tell to kids, but they're stories that are asking to be delved into in a greater way. And both of them, as well as Shira Shirim, are talking about what one can do with rules, with government, with power, with structure, and the ability to create boundaries and break down boundaries for good and for bad, because so much of Root is about that breaking down of boundaries, the welcoming of the stranger, the allowing the other to join, the openness, right? And yet it is very much dealing with that question, all three of them, of how many when do the boundaries work and when do they not? So we'll skip these here just because they, yeah, and there's just a quick quote that kind of speaks to that theme also from Cass's, Beginning of Wisdom, where he speaks about this a lot, right? The idea of the creation of community is about creating a boundary, and yet all of community is about opening boundaries, right? So you've got that tension between those two there. And Megillat Rut, or Hirva, saturation and the opening of boundaries, but also about the gates and the political monarchy and the structure and the boundaries that are born at the end. So I often tell my students that, similar, I guess, to Rav Nachman's quotes, that we don't always necessarily read the books of Tanakh to answer a question, but rather that very often the books are there to raise questions for us. And I don't think any of us have the answer on the perfect balance point between the rules and the boundaries and the openness and the pastoral, but the stories and the imagery of Tanakh all together are definitely pushing us to ask those questions of ourselves and of our society. So I'm totally happy. I haven't checked the chat at all, but I am definitely happy to answer any questions or to get any thoughts. Once you start thinking about the stories of Tanakh that speak to the idea of the field or the city, you'll see that it's everywhere. And I'm really happy to take any examples anyone else can think of that didn't get mentioned, or or any other comments or thoughts on the ideas of these Megillot in tandem with each other. So look out for it now. Whenever you read anything, you've got that theme kind of playing out over and over on itself. All right. I always welcome anyone to, if you think of anything that you want to add or any comment you have, please shoot me an email. I'd love to hear. krupka@ramaz.org. And I hope everyone's reading of Ruth this Shavuot, though it's a very short little reading, has a lot of punch to it.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and we'll look forward to celebrating Shavuot together, and then returning next year for our next Sonnenschein lecture. And we look forward to welcoming Ms. Krupka Berger to the Jewish Center in person at the next possible opportunity.
I would be honored. It's a little early, but definitely Chag Sameach.